Welcome to this presentation. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. And today what I would like to do is to share with you some of the lessons I've learned building SaaS connectors. I work for Beyond Trust, and I took advantage of the SaaS connectivity framework to create some connectors for Beyond Trust. Through this exercise, I did learn some interesting lessons. There's not like a single way to do all the features, to serve all the features I created, but I want to share with you, some of the tricks I found, some of the tricks I learned, also working with my counterparts at SailPoint. And also I may spend a couple of minutes showing you a very interesting tool that I'm using basically on a daily basis to get access to some, logs when I'm, testing connectors, whether they are SCIM connectors, whether they are SaaS connectors. So we'll touch on that briefly. But basically, what happened to me is last year, I remotely attended Developer Days. And that's when I discovered, the SaaS connectivity framework. And I happened to be pretty good at Node.js. So for me, it was, wow, it was a eureka moment. It's like, oh, I want to learn more about this. So what I did is I started to work with the examples that are available on the developer website, basically Airtable, Discourse, and those examples, got me this far. But then, I figured out, hey, I need to figure, a few more things out, like around authentication, around pagination, around error handling. So that's what I want to cover briefly. And in order to do that, what I decided to do is I decided to pick a specific source. So I'm going to use Salesforce. I'm going to talk to the SCIM API for Salesforce. But my goal is not to tell you that, this is a Salesforce connector that you should be using. So there are already some Salesforce connectors that are part of ISC or Identity Now that are there. There's a SaaS one. There's also a SCIM SaaS connector. So these are the connectors you want to use if you need a Salesforce connector, not mine. So mine is just basically a generic example that I decided to use to be able to illustrate some of the findings, some of the lessons that I learned that I want to share with you today. And I've also created a blog. So there is a blog that's in Colab that is specifically designed for this session. So it covers some of the same information that I'm going to share with you during this session. It also includes a download link where you can basically download all the connector code. It's a zip file that you can use. And the idea is that you'll be able to like copy and paste maybe some of the functions or some of the logic that I'm using and use that for your own SaaS connectors. Maybe you're going to come back to me at one point and say, Michel, I found a better way to do this. And that's the kind of feedback also I'm looking for. So we're going to look at the file structure that I'm using, and it's inspired by the Airtable and the Discourse, mostly the Discourse example. I'm also going to touch on global variables, and it's something I discovered working and discussing with my SailPoint counterparts. We figured out that, for example, if you use OAuth and you get a bearer token that you want to be able to reuse for multiple functions, like multiple calls to aggregate accounts, aggregate entitlements, maybe provision, create a new user. The idea is you can take advantage of the global variables. The SaaS connectors run in containers, and they're long-lived. So I'm going to show you how we can leverage the global variables to store not only the bearer token, but also the expire time attribute. So whenever ISC is trying to aggregate accounts, whether or not your bearer token is still valid, whether or not you need to go back to the authentication endpoint to get a new one. So that's one aspect I'm gonna touch on. Reusable functions is another one. I included more functions than were required actually in this connector example. I have some SCIM functions, generic functions. I have some with and without pagination in them. so you can see, if you have to deal with a source that supports pagination, how to, you use the right examples. I have specific functions for like the aggregation of users, but then I have also generic ones where you basically pass the name of the endpoint, whether it's user group or role, as an argument. So I'm gonna touch on that. And one aspect also that I want to touch on is smart error handling. And this is something I figured out when I started to work with those connectors, and then I pushed them to my instances. What I was seeing when something was going wrong, I was seeing an Axios error message, like Axios error 400. What does that mean? And in my current role, I'm also level 2 support for customers and partners that are using integrations between Beyond Trust and SailPoint. And the last thing I want is to throw an error message to an end user, to a customer, that's not going to help them figure out what's the next troubleshooting step. So I included some examples here. Sometimes the source is giving you a good error message. So, hey, let's just pass it through to the ISC UI. Sometimes, it's kind of cryptic. It's like 400, 404, 500, which is pretty bad. So how can we trap these and, remove the Axios 400, 404 error and replace it with something useful? Hey, chances are your URL is wrong. Chances are, you don't have the right permissions for the service account in the source. So that's the ID. And that's what I'm going to cover. So first, I'm going to do a little bit of a code review. I'm not going to go crazy about, writing code live today, but I want to show you, some of the code snippets that I'm referring to. And again, they are available in the blog on the Colab community website. So you can download the zip file and take a look at it yourself. So I'm just going to quickly use the slides to summarize what I want to show you. Then I'm gonna switch to a demo. So we're gonna look at the file structure again. It's inspired by the examples that are on the SaaS community website. SaaS connectivity website, mostly discourse. We're going to also look at, global variables, how to declare them, how to use them, to store, bearer token, expiration time, how to validate every time you get a call from SailPoint that, you either need to get a new bearer token because it's expired, or whether or not you can just, reuse the one that you already have in the global variable. We're going to look at some of the reusable function examples. So I separated them in a separate file that I call skim function. But you could use these examples for a non-skim source as well. You could just use them for a REST source, for example, very easily, like I did in some of the connectors I published to Colab. And we're going to also look at smart error handling, like I mentioned. And you're going to see it's kind of redundant a little bit when you look at smart error handling. I have the first Boolean condition that I'm using for this Salesforce example, just because the error message is good. I just want to pass it through. But at the bottom, you see, basically some mapping that you can use when you don't get a good error message to start with, and you want to basically do a replace for each potential error condition that you are expecting. So I'm going to switch to the live demo right now, and we're just going to take a look at the code using VS Code. So let me just bring VS Code. So again, the structure is very similar to the discourse example. So you're going to see under the SRC, you're going to see tools, where you're going to find a util function. This is where you can decide how to format the attributes that you want to provide to SailPoint when it runs user aggregation, entitlement aggregation. There is the model where you define the different entities, user groups, entitlements that you want to be dealing with. And then, I have these types here. This is where I'm declaring the global variables. And the global variables will include, parameters that I'm capturing from the configuration in ISC. Like, authentication URL, instance URL, client ID, client secret, because I'm using client credentials for OAuth. And then The last two here, access token is basically my bearer token that I want to store in the global variables, and expiration time. And this is sometimes provided directly with an attribute, that gives you the expiration time, but not with Salesforce. And I'm going to touch on that. But basically, by declaring this variable, then you can get into your client file. I'm using the index, invoking the client for the different capabilities, similar to what you see in Airtable in this course. And the first thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to grab the parameters from the configuration from the ISC configuration for the source, and then I'm going to have some handling of the URLs, because sometimes a customer could decide to add the trailing slash. Sometimes it's not there, depending on how they do their copy and paste when they grab those values. So you may want to remove the trailing slash. You may want to just ask via the parameters the instance URL, and then you can append to it like the specific endpoint information for like the Skim API. This is what I'm doing here, and then the ID is first to authenticate. So I have of course an authentication endpoint, and if you look at the shared functions, if I go to the top here, so I'm going to have a function called authentication simple. And this is where I'm basically, trying to grab the bearer token and the expiration time and store it in global variables. So here, Salesforce was a little bit different versus the other sources I work with, which provided an attribute called, expires in, which basically gives me a number of milliseconds when it's going to expire. So Salesforce, the Skim API was basically providing me an attribute called issued at. So I had to do a little bit of research, and I figured out that this is the number of seconds that a typical bearer token will be valid for, specific to Salesforce. So I'm just doing the math here, and I'm adding to issued at the number of seconds or milliseconds that are required to give me an attribute that tells me when the bearer token expires, when I need to go back to the authentication endpoint and generate a new one. So this is the first step. And after that, if we go back quickly to my client file, you're going to see that for each call, like get all accounts, get account, create account. I always have this section here at the beginning of the function, where we invoke a function called check token expiration. So instead of having the logic replicated or duplicated in each function call, I have a function specific to checking the expiration time. So it will just basically pull the expiration time from the global variable. It will compare it with the now time, and that will allow me to figure out whether or not I need to go back to the authentication endpoint. So that's I would say what I'm using to handle the authentication. And my first attempts to build SaaS connectors, what I was doing is I was basically re-authenticating every time I was getting a new call from SailPoint, like user aggregation, entitlement aggregation. But then I was thinking to myself, even if it doesn't look like adding a lot of delays, we probably want to do it in a smarter way. So this is the first aspect I wanted to show. And of course, another aspect is all the reusable options. I have some example like SkimGet with pagination. This example here basically has one argument, the endpoint, whether it's user, whether it's group, whether it's roles, and then it's just using the fact that once you know the endpoint structure for Skim, it's just a matter of adding /user, /group, /roles at the end. If you're discovering, then it's going to be /schema, /service provider config, resource type. So here, these are all examples that you can look at. I have some examples that are specific, but again, these are more for illustrating how it could be done. And this was probably when I started to work with it, and then I wanted to consolidate some of those functions into ones with the endpoint as an argument, so I don't have to create like 5 different Skim functions that are basically identical except for for the specific endpoint. And one aspect that I want to show you now is the error handling. So what I'm doing here is basically taking advantage of the fact that I can basically throw a connector error, which will show up in the ISC user interface, and customize it and make it dynamic. Of course, I can make it static, but what I'm doing here is I'm basically getting an error maybe from a scheme function that I'm calling, and I'm passing this to another function that's called smart error handling. So if I go back to my functions here, smart error handling, this is basically what I'm using for Salesforce. If I happen to have, as part of my error, a response element attached to the error, then, if I'm trusting that the error message is a good one, then, this is really what I want to use, the first block here, and I can ignore the rest. The rest is more pedestrian. It's more, when I'm not getting a good error from the source, and I know by experience that when I'm getting a 404, it's because of this condition, API permissions are not right. When I'm getting a 500, it's probably because there's something wrong with the URL. So I left this here just because, you may have to go down to this pedestrian approach if you don't have a good error message to start with. But if I'm looking at my scheme API using Postman, here's what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to start my npm run dev, so I have a way to start testing my capabilities before I get to ISC. So I can use this Postman collection, which is also provided as part of the zip file that you'll find in the blog. So I can test my output. I can get a list of aggregate accounts, and if you're looking at what's happening here, I use the logs here to basically check whether or not I have an expiration time. The first time I clicked test, I didn't have a bearer token, so it said expiration time is undefined. I don't have a value in my global variable for expiration time, which means I need to authenticate. But the second time around, when I issued the aggregate, I can see, now I do have an expiration time. I compare it with the now time. Expiration time is in the future. Great. I can just reuse the bearer token value that I have in the global variables. I don't need to revisit the authentication endpoint. So this is what I see here. And if I go back to my collection, if I go, for example, to the create user, so I'm just using a post user here, and if I try to submit this for a new user, here's what's going to happen. I'm using a sandbox developer instance of Salesforce, and there's only the possibility to create 10 accounts on it, and I already have 10 accounts, so I reached the limit. But I'm showing this to you because this is a good error message. It's telling me what's going on. So if I'm trying to troubleshoot my provisioning policy and I'm not getting a new user created, I'm scratching my head, what's going on? Well, I'm seeing a good error message here from Salesforce. So why not just be a pass-through for that error message? And that's what I'm doing in the code here. So if you look at what's happening in the code, this is basically the first Boolean here. I have a good response attached to the error. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pass the response data to the connector error. And what this looks like in ISC, I can go to the request center. Before the demonstration, what I did is I just requested an entitlement for a user. I created an application. I can just, for the sake of time, go straight to the error. But this is what it looks like. I did the same thing that I just did in Postman. Try to create a new user via the post/user, and this is the error message I'm seeing here. License limit exceeded. So it's the same one. It's the same one that we've been looking at in Postman. And here the idea again, is to provide an error message to the end user. That's going to be useful. Here, right away, I know what's going on. I don't need to create a support ticket with either, SailPoint or my help desk if I'm a customer, or Salesforce if I'm trying to connect to Salesforce, or BeyondTrust if I'm trying to connect to BeyondTrust. I know exactly what my next troubleshooting step is. Here, it's basically to, get either another instance, or buy or use an instance that's not limited to 10 accounts. But that's the kind of error message that will allow you to basically eliminate or zap a support ticket. And in my role, that's good news, and that saves times also, because you know right away what to do. But there are situations where it's a little bit more tricky to figure out what's going on, and it could be that you're trying to submit a provisioning action to the source. It could be that their documentation is not accurate. So you're looking at the API reference. They're giving you an example of a patch user, but it's not working. So what's going on? So here's a tool that I kind of created and perfected over the years for those more challenging errors. And I initially created this using Node.js, running on a Node.js server, a Linux server. But now I ported it to a Lambda function, an AWS Lambda function, and I've been working a lot with AWS Lambda functions in the recent past. And you have to do a little bit of a port if you're using TypeScript and Node.js to be able to make it work, but it's basically just import and a few other things that you need to update. And then what you can do is you can basically use this to be the man in the middle between two SaaS apps, between ISC and your source, which is Salesforce. And now, you can see everything that's happening. SailPoint's making a request. You're going to see the request, the payload of the request. It could be a /user post. It could be an aggregation call. And then you're going to see the response. And this is like something that you can customize and code in Node.js. So I could say, show me the data that is basically the response from the source when I want to aggregate something. So if I say, if I had a response here, I'm just going to change the code a little bit, redeploy it. And here I created a function URL. And this is documented in a second blog. The first blog, the main blog for this tutorial session, is referencing this other one. But I have a function URL here that I can basically copy into my clipboard. Then I can go back to ISC. And here's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go back to admin. I'm going to go to my sources. And I'm going to pick my SaaS connector version of the Salesforce. So for this session, I called it tutorial. And now I'm going to edit my configuration. And if I go to the URL section, so I could use it for the authentication URL, but this would expose credentials. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use it for, the API URL. So I'm going to paste it. And it's basically a prefix here. So I'm prefixing my URL with the Lambda function URL. And then the suffix is basically the source URL. So I'm going to save that. And now if I go back to the source and let's say I want to import some data, I'm going to run entitlement aggregation. So let's do that. And if I got my IP filters right, I think this should work. Otherwise, I can show you a previous event. Okay, so here, completely transparent for ISC. I got my 88 entitlements aggregated as if I was connecting directly to the Salesforce SCIM API URL. But now, the interesting thing is if I go back to Lambda, and I can access CloudWatch via monitor here, and let's just refresh my CloudWatch. CloudWatch is basically a bucket where you can send all the logs for whatever you do, like Lambda functions. And now, this is the interesting thing. So I can see exactly what's happening. So I can see ISC event incoming. Oh, That means, ISC, Identity Now, or even I use this with Identity IQ as well, sent a request. I can see the request here, received by the Lambda function, and this was basically a slash entitlement, v2 slash entitlements. So that's the first thing. If it was like a Pershing policy, then troubleshooting, I would see a post on slash users, and then I would be able to see the payload. And maybe I can copy it, paste it into Postman, try it outside of the SaaS connector to try to troubleshoot if I have an issue. And then I'm going to see also the response. So I can see here Axios responses because I'm using Axios. I'm seeing the Axios config as well. So you can see what we're submitting to the Salesforce Scheme API, slash entitlements. It's a get on the slash entitlements endpoint. I can see the response, Axios response. So I can see it's just responding with a list of entitlements. And I can also take a look at the headers. But here, the sky is the limit. You basically just decide what you want to console log, and it gives you like the full dialogue. And this has been very useful for me, for example, when I was working on Scheme connectors. For Scheme connectors, if you want to aggregate user, SailPoint, whether it's ISC or IQ, it's going to make calls before it gets the slash users call. It's going to maybe try to discover the schema with slash schema. It's going to go to service provider config. It's going to maybe look at resource type. And anything could go wrong within these calls before the actual slash users call. So this tool has been a lifesaver for me because I've been able to spot like typos in the schema. I've been able to spot issues with filters. Sometimes it's just the format of the filters that wasn't supported by my Scheme API for the source. So if you want to use this tool, again, this is a separate blog. The code is in there. And I've been using AWS free tier, which allowed me to learn Lambda over the last few months and run this troubleshooting tool as a Lambda function. Before I was running it with Node.js server. I had to get a GoDaddy certificate. Not anymore with AWS. That's one of the advantages. So again, my goal today was to basically introduce you to some of the code that I've been putting together for my SaaS connectors. I wanted also to show you a troubleshooting tool that has been a lifesaver for me. A few other things that I wanted to share. If we can quickly go back to the presentation, just to wrap up, there is also one thing that I would say would be interesting as an enhancement to be able to add within the connector spec JSON to add the possibility to manage entitlement attributes or entitlement hierarchy, to have parent and children entitlements, because that's something that right now I'm not able to push through my SaaS connector spec JSON. I have to do an API call after I push my connector to SailPoint. But I would say other than that, everything has been perfect for me. I really, really like the SaaS connectivity, and I want to encourage you to take a look at it. I think it's one of the best connector SDK that I've worked with in my career, and I hope that you're going to find the information that I'm sharing useful in your journey to learn and SaaS connectivity and build your own connectors. So thank you very much for your time and for watching this session. And don't hesitate to share some feedback with me.